Welcome to Real Foot Forward, a West Tennessee podcast from Discovery Park of America in Union City, Tennessee. Today's episode is brought to you by Jiffy Steamer, the largest steamer manufacturer in the world. It started in 1940 right here in Obion County, Tennessee. Find the Jiffy Steamer dealer closest to you at jiffysteamer.com.
Thank you, Caroline. Welcome, everybody, to Real Foot Forward, a West Tennessee podcast where we explore the history, the people, and the culture of our home right here in West Tennessee. I'm your host, Scott Williams. Okay, Caroline, before I introduce today's guest, share with me something you discovered this week at Discovery Park of America.
This week, I had the chance to walk around our new steampunk exhibit here at Discovery Park, and I really enjoyed how interactive and hands-on the exhibit was. But my favorite thing that I discovered was the Van de Graaff generator because I was able to experience the creation of static electricity.
That was very cool. I think my favorite part of that temporary exhibit is H.G. Wells. As a kid, H.G. Wells and the War of the Worlds, that was really the first book that resonated with me and that I really discovered the excitement and the joy that could be found from reading a good book. So I'm really excited about that exhibit as well. So thanks for picking that. Today's very special guest is Ginger Hadley. She's a descendant of Marcus Winchester, the very first mayor of Memphis, and she's discovered some really interesting things in her research of her famous ancestor. Welcome, Ginger.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me on.
So first of all, tell us a little bit about you and where you came from, how you ended up in Memphis to begin with.
Well, I was originally born in Houston, but I've been here all of my life. I think we moved back when I was 2, and all of my family is here as well. I'm the youngest of 5 daughters and have 4 children of my own and 8 grandchildren.
Well, do you recall how you discovered that you were a descendant of the first mayor of Memphis?
Well, it's funny. We knew all of our lives that we were descendants of the Winchesters, but I didn't put it together until I was considerably older that he was the Winchester that was the mayor. So it kind of lit a fire under me to start researching.
What neighborhood did you grow up in Memphis?
I was out in East Memphis by St. Louis School. We grew up there all of our lives. We were within a 2-block radius of the church.
So whenever you saw Winchester Boulevard, did it resonate with you? Oh, that's my Winchester.
It did, in some vague fashion, though I never really knew too much about where that came from. And later found out there's also a second portion of Winchester Road.
Tell us a little bit, about discovering genealogy and about what age were you when you first started plugging in those names into ancestry.com and when the fire was first lit.
Well, I've always been a history lover. I found it fun to take electives in high school, like Russian history and that type of thing. But in 2008, I was recovering from knee surgery and thought it would be the perfect time to kind of play around on Ancestry and see what it was all about. Really, when it was first coming out to the public knowledge. And once you're in it and start hitting those leaves and finding information, you're an addict pretty quickly. And
yeah,
I've been doing it ever since.
It seems like in every family, there's 1 or 2 people that are addicted to ancestry.com these days and exchanging information and testing their DNA. And so I can attest to the fact that it is extremely addictive.
Absolutely. And my oldest son is an archaeologist and anthropologist on top of it. So we've always had that bond where we would watch history documentaries, Wings of War, that type of thing. So I've always had a companion as they were growing up.
Yeah, that's good. I know those of us that are interested are always keeping our eyes open for which child is going to take up the info once we are gone and continue sharing the information. It's very sad when a family ends up without any historians, and the photos and the Bibles and everything end up in antique stores.
Oh, absolutely. That just breaks my heart. In fact, this last week, I indoctrinated my oldest granddaughter, who was on her way to the beach and asking me for a book. And I got talking to her about my very favorite book is 1776. And
Awesome.
at first, she was a little taken aback by the suggestion. I said, just read the first chapter, and it hooked her. So hopefully she'll be the guardian of all things ancestry when I'm no longer around.
Oh, that's great. Well, for those who are, and even honestly, people from Memphis don't really even know about Marcus Winchester. So I would say the vast majority of the people listening have no idea who Marcus Winchester was. So give us just a little bit of the elevator speech on the first mayor of Memphis.
Well, absolutely. Marcus, to me, was an amazing man. He was the oldest son of 15 children of General James Winchester of Revolutionary War fame and War of 1812. And in fact, he was away at school when he had to leave to be his father's aide at the age of 15, and was captured by the English, imprisoned in Quebec. So he had a military upbringing. And when the founders of Memphis, Overton, Jackson, and Winchester, met with the Chickasaw to discuss the treaty, which is referred to as the Chickasaw Treaty, Marcus went with them. And as an end result, he was sent as their representative to Memphis to lay it out, survey it, and plot the city.
Now, you and I have both discussed, I believe the early historian of Memphis was James Davis.
Right.
Is that his name? And,
it was.
And he wrote the history of Memphis, and he mentions Marcus Winchester, but, we both suspect some of what he wrote was as much fantasy as it was fact. But I was fascinated by the fact that he wrote that when Marcus Winchester was a prisoner of war up north during the Revolution, or maybe even in Canada during the Revolutionary War in Canada, that he was quite popular with the local ladies who would come to observe the prisoners, and that he was a fan favorite there somehow.
Right. It seems that he was quite the ladies' man. He and his brother were well known for that, I believe. But they were up there for about 6 weeks before they were traded back to I guess you would call them now the American troops, but at that time the Continental troops, and released. So,
well, and then I'm also fascinated by Memphis. At the beginning, on the Bluff, there was a very different Memphis than we know of today. Can you describe a little bit of what it was probably like when Marcus first was sent there to sort of help lead the development of a new community?
Absolutely. Well, before Marcus came to the area, the Chickasaw Nation held the Memphis Bluffs as their main meeting area. And in fact, there's a mound that was down by the Ornamental Metal Museum, if you're familiar with that was subsequently used as a fort. During the Civil War, it was where they held their cache of weapons and ammunition. But
I've slid down it in the snow. It makes a good place to slide down as well.
Absolutely. That's one of those places that my son is always wanting to show members of the family. So we're pretty familiar with it as well. But when Marcus got here, it was very rough. There was one landing leading down, a natural landing leading down to the river, which smart Marcus made his ferry boat station. So not only did he start the first store in Memphis at the top of that landing, which is currently, I guess it would be Front and Market, if I'm not mistaken, right in front of the pyramid. But behind the pyramid is where that natural landing was. So he started up a ferry business crossing back and forth between Memphis and Hopeville, Arkansas, which is now lost to the river. It was a thriving town, and they owned thousands of acres over there. If you go over at the low water mark sometime during the end of summer and look off to your right towards St. Louis, you'll occasionally see the top of the pergola of the old train station that was the Hopefield Little Rock train station.
Wow, that's cool.
Yeah.
And Marcus was he was brought up, he wasn't he didn't grow up in a little cabin. So when he moved to Memphis and settled it was a big difference from the way he had grown up. His parents had built an impressive plantation, I guess you would call it, correct?
Absolutely. Their home was known as Cragfont, and it's up by Gallatin, Tennessee, on Bledsoe Creek, which was a prime place for them to build. And his father, James, was of the nature that he brought in artisans from Baltimore, and they quarried the stone right there on site and built it of this beautiful gray limestone. It was quite impressive. If you can just imagine the frontier at that time, they were still facing Indian attacks. In fact, his brother is known as the last person to be killed by an Indian attack in the state of Tennessee. But they had a fort just not too far from them. And everyone stayed close, but they were the first to build a house of stature, I guess you'd call it, in Tennessee.
And it's a national, it's on the National Registration of Historic Places. It's a tourist attraction now. I've not been able to visit it. Have you visited?
I have, and it's really just so beautiful. I encourage anyone that is interested in history to go. Not only is the house really beautiful and filled with originals that have been donated back to the estate for display, but their gardens and cemetery are just beautiful. The gardens are renowned for their white peonies. In fact, there's even rumor that one of the grandmothers, Mariah Black, is buried in the garden. So,
wow, that must be a special feeling for you to get to go back there when you actually descend from those folks.
Oh, it is quite. It's you get goosebumps walking among your ancestors. But this is one of the reasons that I'm so heavily into this. I don't want them forgotten. I don't want their names lost to history.
Well, and so one of my the reason that I was aware of Marcus Winchester was because of his relationship with David Crockett. And David Crockett became friends with both Marcus and his wife. And we can talk a little bit about that in a minute. But first of all, let's introduce Marcus's wife to the listeners. Tell me a little bit about her, because she also had a fascinating history.
Absolutely. Her name was Marie Amarant Loisel Barabeau. So the French runs strong in our family. She went by Amarant, but the Memphians called her Mary. I guess they couldn't wrap their head around it. So you will see both names interchangeably, but all of the legal documentation has Amarant. Now, she was a property owner in her own right in an age when that just was not done with Americans. But being French and from St. Louis, Missouri, it was commonplace. The interesting thing about her, and heartbreaking at the same time, was that she was a woman of color, though it has now come out, we believe that she was Osage. her grandfather was the Osage Indian agent, and her grandmother was Osage. So we believe that's where we're leading, though I have been unable to verify that through DNA. The culture does not really allow DNA research outside of members of the tribes. So that's something that'll be a future search for me. But in Memphis, she was quite active. She helped the needy and the ill. And by about 1830, she had become a weapon against Marcus. So as you will see in story after story in the South, her color was the basis of even passing laws. And by 1837, they had a law against interracial marriage. And she was simply referred to as mulatto, which she would have been in St. Louis as well. But the French meaning of mulatto is just a dark-skinned person of mixed race. It wasn't a black and white comment as we know it is today in the United States.
Well, and as a result of this, she actually wasn't even able to live within the city limits, right? They had a farm outside of town for them. For us, it would be in Memphis.
Exactly. So we're talking about the Cleveland and Union area of today, but she had been so put upon and attacked so virulently in press, and I would imagine to her face, that she had taken the children and moved out to their farm named Muskogee Camp, another hearkening back to Native Americans. And as well, they also had their land over in Hopeville, Arkansas, where she made jams and bottled up honey and sold as well. But she did not become a lifelong resident of downtown Memphis.
How many children did they end up having together?
So they had 8 children, all of which show up in the censuses as living with Amarant in Muskogee Camp. And in that census, they are listed as mulatto. The next census was after her death, and they're all living with Marcus and listed as white.
Interesting. You also discovered, speaking of race and research, you also discovered something that people didn't know about Marcus Winchester and his own heritage through his mother's line, I believe.
That's right. And I don't think that the city of Memphis would have gone down the same path they did had they known it. But it turns out that his mother, Susan Black, her grandfather and great-grandfather were free men of color. The African-American DNA comes in through the Winchester line. And we've proved this through a lawsuit that was brought against one of her grandfathers, Gideon Gibson, who had to appear before the House of Burgesses in the Carolinas. And it's documented there that not only is he a man of means, he was a landowner. Unfortunately, he was also a slave owner, but they had a thriving community of interracially married families, which was very common at that time.
Well, and it's interesting to think of this guy who was so influential, in Memphis, having both that heritage, and a wife that was non-white as well. Even though his wife lived out of town, he still developed a thriving business in Memphis. And one of my favorite stories, of course, is when David Crockett had a wreck with a flatboat filled with barrel staves. He was trying to get to New Orleans. He crashed right down from Mud Island, And when he was rescued, the first person they took him to, because he was already somewhat of a celebrity by then, so they took him to Marcus Winchester, and David Crockett stayed with Marcus and Amaranth Winchester and became very, very good friends. And Marcus funded some of David Crockett's future political campaigns, much to the frustration of John Overton and Andrew Jackson. So we've got correspondence where John Overton said, "Cut it out, quit sponsoring him. We're trying to get rid of him." But he continued to secretly fund Crockett's campaigns. And David Crockett was just one of the many people that developed a good relationship with the Winchesters. There were some folks working to try to end slavery. Tell us a little bit about others who developed relationships with the Winchesters.
Absolutely. Well, Francis Wright and Robert Owen, who you may know from Neshoba. So there's a street in Memphis called Neshoba, and we've always had vague notions that there was a community referred to as Neshoba, which I did finally locate. But it was a utopian type society. They were free thinkers. They did not believe in slavery. They had open marriages, what we would refer to as a free sex type colony. And their idea was to purchase away slaves from plantations or wherever they could purchase them, teach them how to live on their own and emancipate them. Unfortunately, the area that they bought, they had several thousand acres from what is now Park Avenue all the way down to the Wolf River. At that time, it was a yellow fever plagued area because of the swampy nature of so much of that land, which Frances did come down with. And she ended up having to leave and go back to Scotland and recover from. At that point, the community started falling apart. But they were so close with the Winchesters that Amaranth and Marcus named their son Robert Dale Owen and one of their daughters, Frances Wright Winchester.
Oh, that's interesting. And that reminds me of the way that Marcus Winchester's father named his children, and also is the one who named Memphis. What was Marcus's full name? Was it Marcus?
Marcus Brutus.
Yeah.
One of his brothers is Lucilius. There's a Lucilius Publicola. There are quite a few Egyptian names, Greek names, and he was apparently enthralled with it. And Marcus continued that with the naming of his own children.
Yeah, so we now know exactly where the idea for naming Memphis came from.
That's right, Memphis, Egypt.
So Marcus's wife dies fairly young, correct?
Yes, she died in 1839. Now, they had family from St. Louis, Missouri, all the way down to New Orleans on both Winchester and Loisel and Baraboo sides. So while, as you had mentioned, James Davis's book on history, we'll call it, referred to her traveling to New Orleans as if she had been shunned from Memphis, she was actually staying with family. I even found the address that she was at when she passed. So she was on a trip to New Orleans when she passed away at a very young age, leaving Marcus to raise 8 children. And before long, he had remarried a much younger woman, Lucy Ferguson, who was a family friend that he had promised her husband that he would look after her and ensure her safety while he made a trip to Europe, which unfortunately he died during. And so at 19, she was brave enough to take on the raising of 8 children.
And later on down the line, things did not go well for Marcus Winchester. He suffered, he probably drank a lot, from all the stress and the anxiety, and his enemies tried to squash him and get rid of him. Ultimately, he did not have a happy ending in his life, unfortunately.
No, he didn't. As years went by and lawsuits were filed against him, he slowly had to start selling off property that they had amassed in both Shelby County and in Arkansas to settle lawsuits. And eventually, I believe he was only 50 when he had his first heart attack, and about 51 when he had a fatal heart attack. He had lingered a day before his own death. At that point, Lucy was on her own to raise the children that were still minors and get by as they could.
And his story really didn't end with his death, because they had set aside a cemetery where the notables of Memphis would be buried. Talk a little about that cemetery and what eventually happened to it.
Right. So, as most people are unaware of, there were not formal cemeteries back in those days, and people tended to be buried on family land and whatnot. But as Memphis grew, you can imagine that became a challenge. So Marcus and the Winchesters donated property, which is now situated behind St. Jude, as the city burying ground. It was referred to as Winchester Cemetery. I believe there are 5 mayors buried there. There are senators, congressmen, all sorts of people buried there, to the tune of about 13,500 people who were eventually buried there. The cemetery went through a lot of changes over the years. The caretaker had passed away, and his wife, I think she did her darndest to keep it up, but it must have been overwhelming. At the same time, the city of Memphis cut through several streets. There was a rail line cut through, and at some point along the line, most of the headstones had been cracked or broken up, and they even made this into a park, which I just can't fathom. But it was a different day and age. They even had a children's wading pool there at one point. But the biggest atrocity in my mind's eye is that they built the city garage over Marcus Winchester and who knows how many others' graves. At that point, it was horses and buggies that were kept there. Later, it was upgraded to store actual city trucks. That garage stands empty to this day. I believe they use the parking lot for some storage of vehicles, but they will never break ground on that, as far as we know. And it sort of goes to not wanting these people to be forgotten, that it just breaks my heart that this happened.
And you shared with me an article or a paper by Midge Gurley called Abandoned, Abused, and a Municipal Pariah, The Life and Death of Winchester Burying Ground.
Exactly. It's a beautiful article, which I encourage everyone to read. It's in the West Tennessee Historical Papers. And that's where I was able to find so many facts about this and led me in my own research. But it's really a beautiful tale of what happened, and a heartbreaking one at the same time.
So you're not a historian by career, neither am I, but we are both passionate about it and enjoy it. Why do you think it's important for us today and for our own descendants tomorrow to remember these people that came before us?
Well, I feel strongly first of all, that everyone should know their history. It may not be important to my grandchildren today, but somewhere down the line, they will have questions. And unfortunately, I waited too late. I didn't have people to go back and ask where we came from or who are we. But on top of that, there's so much divisiveness in Memphis right now and around the country, as everyone knows. But if you scratch just a little bit below the surface, you realize that we're not all that different. As so many African-American families find out, they have European ancestry. And if more European descendants scratched under the surface, they'd find their own African-American ancestry, not to mention Native American.
Yeah, it's fascinating. The more people look and the more they research, they'll find out the diversity that most people have in their heritage. I mean, a lot of people who I know who are ancestry fans are looking for, they want to find Native American heritage because
true.
That's cool, but, oftentimes the rumors in most families are, well, we have Native American or we have African American, heritage. And sometimes that turns out to be true and sometimes it doesn't.
I think it is an opportunity for people to learn that we are not so different from one another, that the atmosphere that we find our country in right now could be so different if they just knew the truth of their history, their own history.
Yeah, and I think it's helpful to go back and know what happened in the past in both politics and religion and government and society, and it makes it more fun when you have a personal connection back to the people that were living at that time, and it helps put history in context. So for me, I think it's really important to share that with my kids and grandkids, and as we talked about earlier, ignite an interest in history so that hopefully somebody will have the same passions.
Absolutely. I'm counting on that with my granddaughter, and I hope I can foster it with the other 7 grandchildren as well.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you so much for sharing this with us. For people who want more, you and I have talked, you need to write a book about this.
I'll need some help with that from you, but I would love to.
That sounds great. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And I will, you've inspired me. The mission of Discovery Park of America is to inspire children and adults to see beyond, and you've inspired me to want to get online and do some more research this weekend.
Absolutely.
Thanks to all of you listeners who have joined Ginger, Caroline, and me today at Discovery Park of America. Our mission here is to inspire children and adults to see beyond. To plan an experience here for you and your family, visit discoveryparkofamerica.com.